Well, good afternoon. Thanks, Don, for that introduction and for having me here today. I really am excited to be here at the launch of this incredible center. When I first got to know Don's work, I don't know if I've ever told you, it really affected my thinking. So if you ever wonder, do academics change policy? It really did. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. But first, I just want to reflect on how critical the work you're doing is for our country at this moment in time. For many of us, these past few weeks, and even longer, have truly been heartbreaking. We mourn the tragic loss of those who died at the Tree of Life Synagogue, as well as the 2 African-American shoppers who were killed in the grocery store in Kentucky in a crime that is being investigated as a racially motivated hate crime. Both of these crimes were committed by people who were white supremacists. And we know that we've seen an increase in the hatred and divisiveness in our country. But we also need to remain mindful of the power of our nation to come together. And so that's why I'm energized to be here with you all, because the innovative academics and scholars that we have here play an important role in that broader movement for change. And I thank you for your courage and your commitment to act, because we know that our sorrow and outrage is not enough without that action. And I, like you, am passionate about equality because I know how important it is to an individual's human dignity. And I just want to share my story briefly. My parents came to this country from China for a better life. My father came for graduate school, and he's now a professor at Rutgers, focusing on cancer prevention. My mother came in 3rd grade, and she's now a retired judge. She served on the Workers' Compensation Court in New Jersey. But growing up, when I was young, she talked to me about the discrimination she was feeling in her workplace. She started out as a dietitian. And I saw the impact that experiencing exclusion and adverse treatment had on her sense of self-worth. And I came home one day from maybe 4th grade, and I told her I wrote this essay about discrimination. And she looked at me in shock and horror. And she said, "Did you use the word racism?" And I said, "No, I think I just said prejudice." And she was like, "Okay, that's better." And I realized then that she was worried that my teacher would somehow think badly of us. I grew up in suburban New Jersey in a not very diverse community. And so what I realized at that moment, that issues around discrimination were so important, but you weren't supposed to talk about it. And we know that we'll never solve the problems of discrimination unless we are willing to have those conversations and really talk about it. So today, our country is at a crossroads. We have seen that rising tide of intolerance, and we have seen many more people and communities feel vulnerable and afraid. And in times like this, I look back at the transformative power of people coming together to advance equality. A national commitment to address race discrimination created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which gave rise to it. The agency opened its doors 1 year after the Civil Rights Act was passed as part of Title VII. And this single law transformed American society, perhaps more than any other. But this act was not the inevitable result of progress. It was a direct result of the organizing of many. And the civil rights movement and the tumultuous times of the 50s and 60s led people to come together to create the momentum needed to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And that act was passed on a bipartisan basis, including 27 Republicans. And these issues can't be partisan. These issues are about human dignity, and they must include all of us. And I'm reminded of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s words, "True peace is not merely the absence of tension, it's the presence of justice." And we know we've made great strides towards progress over the past 50 years, but we know acutely that our work is unfinished. 3 years ago, as I look back, we were celebrating the EEOC's 50th anniversary. And I was struggling with how do we lift up the issues of discrimination that we continue to see in the workplace, because so many people thought that those problems were solved. Many people thought we had our first African American president. We were beyond racism. The differences we saw were due to education, economic differences, but not discrimination. But what we've seen in recent years is that America still has entrenched problems around equality of opportunity. I was struck by Gallup's polling in this area. Last year, Americans hit an all-time high with 42% saying that they personally worry a great deal about the state of race relations. And another 27% said they worry a fair amount. So that brings us to 69% of our country that are personally worried, at least a fair amount, about the state of race relations. And over the 17 years that Gallup has done this poll, the historic low was 13% who worried a great deal personally. And that was in 2010, so not long after the election of President Obama. So we've seen a rise in nearly 30 percentage points since that time. The numbers began to surge in 2014 after the high-profile killings of unarmed black men by police. At that time, 17% of those surveyed expressed serious concern. The next year, that jumped to 28% in 2015. So not surprisingly, there's also a great political divide, with 59% of Democrats expressing great concern, compared to 29% of Republicans. But even that number has grown dramatically for Republicans since 2014. So while I would have preferred not to live through this period of hatred and bigotry that we're experiencing, the silver lining, I suppose, is that at least the majority of our country is now aware that we have serious problems. And as they say, admitting a problem is the first step to trying to fix it. So to make meaningful progress, I've been thinking about how we build the social movements that includes people from all backgrounds and experiences. In the highly charged political environment that we're in, it can feel very scary to enter into some of those conversations. So I've been looking for ways to bring in new voices and perspectives, and to give people the benefit of the doubt when they're trying but may stumble, so that we can expand the coalitions of support for change. So in addition to this will to solve our problems, we need to understand the nature of them. And that is where the work of this center comes in. Analyzing data on issues from LGBT discrimination, technology firm demographics, as well as harassment is incredibly powerful to shaping decisions, not just by policymakers, but also businesses. And it was very clear to me at the EEOC that we could do better in using our data. And that's why I was so grateful for Don and others here coming in to help us, because I knew that we had data that was valuable, but we were under-resourced. The EEOC has a continual challenge of having to investigate every charge that's filed and having an increased number of charges. Often there is this feeling we can't afford to do something different than just investigating our charges. We can't afford to take that step back to do a broader understanding of what those systemic barriers are. So I know that even this administration appreciates the kinds of partnerships that we've been able to build with academia to help us solve some of our most challenging problems. So I mentioned before how Don's work really shaped my thinking. So when I first got to the EEOC, I got a copy of Documenting Desegregation, which Don wrote, and it's really the only book looking at the EEO1 data. That's data the EEOC has collected since 1966 to better understand and support the enforcement work of the agency. The agency collects data by workforce demographics, race, ethnicity, gender, by different job categories. And Don had analyzed that work and had found that we had made the greatest progress as a country in the 1970s, shortly after the act was passed, but that we had largely stalled in making progress in the 80s and 90s. And he had attributed a lot of that to the decline in social movements, the decline in the civil rights movement, in the women's movements. And that was really powerful to me because even though I had been an employment litigator my whole career, I had sort of assumed that progress had been somewhat linear, that we were continuing to integrate different industries. And when you look at the data, you see that that isn't true. So one of the things I'm doing in my post-EEOC life is I'm at the Urban Institute, so I'm also trying to think about research and data and how we translate that into policy. But I'm looking at the changing nature of work, different workplace structures, independent contractors, temporary workers, the on-demand economy as part of it. And how do we ensure that we increase job quality when workers have even declining power in those structures, when we have technology shifting the way we work? But we know with occupational segregation that certain communities are going to be impacted more severely than others when those jobs go away. African Americans and Latinos, for example, are significantly overrepresented in jobs such as driving that are likely to be automated in the near term. So those are issues where I think there are opportunities for potential collaboration with this center and thinking about the broader future of work. And what I wanted to share with you is a bit about what I'm thinking now that we've had this year of the Me Too movement, the Time's Up effort, and what are those opportunities that we have? You know, I stayed at the EEOC for a year into this administration, and I wanted to stay really just to protect our work. And the hardest moment I had was when the Office of Management and Budget decided to indefinitely stay the pay data collection that we had worked so hard on, expanding the EEO1 data to collect for the first time information about pay by race, gender, and ethnicity. But what heartens me is the work that Massachusetts and other states and localities are leaving, both to create that accountability so employers will look under the hood and take a look at their pay, and it's shifting the norms for employers. And to be able to actually have access to that data is, I think, incredibly powerful. So despite that setback, I am excited by the possibilities that this research provides. And in the broader context of the Me Too movement, I do think there's an opportunity to broaden that conversation to understanding how the power dynamic has led to a culture of harassment, how there have been systemic failures in HR, in complaint processes, in accountability that have allowed powerful people not to be held accountable. And I think the moment that we have now is that things are fundamentally shifting. Back in the time, now this is the Farragher-Elderth decision, when the Supreme Court created this affirmative defense that's really shifted how employers act to have a sexual harassment policy and to do some training. About like 43% or so of the population thought that sexual harassment was a significant problem. So this was after Anita Hill had raised the issues at the Clarence Thomas hearings in 1991. And it was still a minority of the population. So one of the big shifts we've seen is that now close to 70% of Americans think that sexual harassment is an important issue, and that the climate now has created that opportunity to hold people accountable. There was a poll out yesterday that I think had about 69% thought that was the climate today. But we also know there's been also incredible backlash. So about 4 in 10 people thought that the movement has gone too far. And I think it's important in understanding where we are now with employers that there's much in the way of difference between what's motivating employers and what might be out there in the political world. Because what we've seen in the employer community is, by and large, not at every firm, and Don's the expert on differences by firms, but we've seen there is an interest in taking more affirmative action to prevent harassment. There is a higher sensitivity to the stakeholders, both internal employees, outside consumers, as well, board shareholders, publicity over these issues, and so it's creating that momentum for change. And we've seen it also with other issues around broader gender equality, where women have come together to talk about not only sexual harassment, but pay disparities, barriers to promotion, and other kinds of disparaging conduct that they've experienced. So we're hopeful that, in the folks that I've been working with around the Me Too movement, is that we can build on this recognition to create broader and lasting change, because it's that attitude shift that we're seeing now that has really led to long-term change. And I think about Justice Kennedy's words in the marriage equality decision. And he said something to the effect of, the nature of injustice is that we often do not see it in our own time. And that, I think, is very true about discrimination against LGBT individuals, and also sexual harassment, conduct that was considered, looking back at the case law, courts didn't think this was sex discrimination, similar to not thinking discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity was sex discrimination. Courts thought it was the inevitable result of women entering the workforce, or just was an assault that happened to occur at work, and they did not make the connections to sex harassment as a form of discrimination until after the EEOC issued guidance on this in the early 80s. So it hasn't been that long. So that gives me hope in seeing the changes in our attitudes and that possibility. And one of the things I've been looking at, a friend of mine, Leslie Crutchfield, wrote a book on movement building and how change happens. And she went back and looked at the gay marriage movement, the gun control movements, tobacco-free kids, mothers against driving, and she found like the common thread was each of the successful movements that changed attitudes really connected with people on a human level. And so in marriage equality, they found that actually talking about equality it motivated people who were already with them on the issue, but it did not motivate the movable middle that they were trying to get in their campaigns around the country. And in focus group testing, they would ask people, so why do you think gay people want to get married? And people would say, I don't know, benefits, visitation rights. And they'd say, well, why did you want to get married? And they would say, love. So when they shifted their campaign message around love, people started to connect at a human level. So what I've been thinking about for our movements around equality, and you would think equality, fairness, should be a human value, but it's often seen as a zero-sum game, right? We've seen that sort of happening in communities around the country, and I do think there's an opportunity to get people to see we want to be a place where everyone has the opportunity to succeed. It isn't about giving certain groups over advantages for others, but really removing those barriers to opportunity and creating fair practices. So it's with that I hope to keep following the work of this center and to find opportunities to collaborate in both making the invisible problems visible, as Don said, and to strengthening and building this movement for equality. Thank you so much.